Hi everybody and welcome to Get Good Press, finding and sharing stories that the media won't refuse. My name is Emily Campbell. I work for the Home Space Society, which is an affordable housing provider in Calgary, Alberta. We've got about 30 buildings and counting scattered across the city, and our mission is really to house the most vulnerable in our community. But I wasn't always a communications advisor. In fact, prior to this year, I was a news reporter in Montreal. Before that, I worked in Vancouver. I've also worked in Atlanta for CNN. I've worked in radio and television. So I'm here to tell you how to get into journalists' brains and really catch their interest so that they pick up the stories that you're interested in sharing with the public. So just to show you that I was a journalist once upon a time, here's a little clip from my demo reel that I hope is a little bit fun.
Emily Campbell has details.
What happened at the courthouse is extremely unusual. Judges don't typically add testimony from other witnesses once a trial has started.
Well, now a report from the Montreal police seemingly confirming systemic racism in the force. Emily Campbell with more on that right now.
It's the first time police have acknowledged there's a racial bias problem within the force. The saga over softball in Jean Mont's Park continues. Will the long-standing community have a place to play this summer? You can see and smell the remnants of the latest spill here on Henri Bourassa. Some meat on this trunk hanging from these branches and some organs on the ground. But the video from last night looks like something out of a slasher film. What you're about to see is extremely graphic and maybe disturbing. Nurses and healthcare workers say their patience for the government is on artificial ventilation. They're frustrated by frequent mandatory overtime that's having major impacts on their health and home life.
So not that long ago, that's the industry I was working in, so I will try to share with you what I know. First, let's talk about how newsrooms work. Right at the very top of the pyramid is the news director. They make big decisions and is everybody's boss. Assignment editors decide what reporters are going to be doing that day, what stories are going to make it onto the 6 o'clock news on TV at night. Anchors have risen throughout the ranks and now they've got the cushy job presenting the news rather than going out and chasing it. They'll often rewrite scripts to suit their cadence, and they'll also jump in on breaking news events if things need to go live to air right away. Producers, this is more of a radio term. Producers are the people behind the radio hosts, and they kind of decide which stories are going to be talked about on longer programs, or they'll do the research so that the hosts know what they're going to say, and they're coordinating with interviews so that everything's kind of ready to go for the hosts when they're ready. Then you've got section editors. This is more of a print term. So with a newspaper, you've got news, you've got opinion, you've got, automotive, lifestyle, etc., etc. They decide which stories are going into the paper that day. Camera operators and editors, this is really more on the video side. They're doing the technical jobs kind of behind the scenes. And the lowly reporters, this counts for radio, television, and newspapers. But these are also people that you kind of want to pay attention to. Of all these jobs, these are the ones that you want to focus on because they decide what stories are going to make the news. So you want to make sure that you're pitching things that you know that they're going to be interested in. Now keep in mind that reporters are people too. So they have their own personal interests that you really want to latch onto, and find your allies. When I was a reporter for CTV in Montreal, I really cared about covering racial profiling stories, queer issues, and homelessness, obviously, as that's the industry that I wound up in. So I developed really good relationships with some of the workers at homeless shelters in the city, and they would call me if they needed some public attention drawn to an issue. Let's say they're having issues with, not in my backyard, NIMBYs. About their new homeless shelter location, or maybe a real estate developer next door is kicking their clients, off their property and onto the street. They would call me sometimes in the morning, and I'd call my boss and say, "Hey, I'm really interested in doing this story. What do you say?" And more often than not, I get to cover that story. So it's really valuable to build relationships with journalists that you know care about what you do. So I just want to take a minute right now and have you think about a story from your organization that you'd like to workshop a little bit. You know, maybe there's a client of yours that's doing really well, or maybe you're ticked off because you've lost some funding for a initiative that's really helpful to people. Or maybe there's an issue in your town or your city that's really affecting the people that you work with. Or maybe there's a fundraiser that needs some attention, you know, coming up in the next few months. So just get that story in your mind and keep it in mind as we go through the rest of the presentation. So the one thing that you got to know about reporters is that they're really busy, their deadlines are crazy, they're probably stressed out, and they're kind of lazy. So if you want to give them a story that you want to make sure will be covered, make sure that you hand it to them on a platter. And what that means is I want you to write your press releases like stories. Have your interviewees available, think in images, be responsive, and consider whether your story is really news. And we're going to go through these points in a little bit more detail. So let's look at a press release. When it comes to press releases, you want to keep them brief, really concise. Make sure that the story part of your press release is 1 page maximum. You can have a little write-up about, you know, your organization and put your contact information on a second page, but make sure that the meat of your story is on 1 page max. Start your media release with a lead. So in this example, this is a media release about a story about fundraising for palliative care expansion in the city of Calgary. Calgary doesn't have like a dedicated palliative care service for people who are experiencing homelessness, and the needs of those people are a little different. You know, if you've got mental health issues, if you have active addictions, then it's hard for a regular hospice to handle some of our clientele. And so we really need to expand on palliative care here in Calgary. So it's a fundraiser, we wanted some attention, but I thought, you know what, the media is not going to care about a fundraiser because media typically don't care about fundraisers. Like, you know, a fundraiser on its own isn't a story, but the story is behind the fundraiser, and it's about what happens if people experiencing homelessness can't access palliative care that's appropriate to their needs. Worst case scenario, we've got people dying on the street. And so look at the first line of this press release. It says, Calgary homeless find dignity in death with specialized palliative care. Tell them what the story is about. The program aims to prevent unhoused Calgarians from a tragic death in the street. This might sound a little bit dramatic to you, but this is candy for a reporter. So make sure in the rest of your press release that you're including quotes from people who will be available to answer questions once you send this press release out, and of course, your contact information. So the next point is having your interviewees available. That means that anybody that the media is going to want to talk to about the story, make sure that you have their contact information, they're ready to go, you've reserved their time, everybody is set to talk to the media that day. Of the people that you might consider speaking to the media, it's important to have a voice of authority. So maybe, you know, the CEO or the communications person from your organization, and you could have a professional opinion as well. So that might be, you know, a researcher or somebody who works closely on the ground with your clientele, somebody who's got professional experience dealing with the issue that you're thinking about. And then the most important thing is to make sure that you've got somebody there who has lived experience with whatever issue that you are trying to get coverage for. So, you know, if you're doing a fundraiser for cancer, then you better have a cancer patient there or the family of somebody who had that cancer. If you're working with the homeless population, then give those people a voice. The media wants to talk directly to people who are experiencing the issue that you're trying to solve. Of course, you've got your own priorities when it comes to protecting people's privacy, but if you can find somebody who's willing and stable enough to speak with the media, having that lived experience is invaluable, and it will be much more appealing to journalists to cover that story. And then, especially for television, I want you to think in images. Imagine what that news story is going to look like. If you invite the media to a press conference and it's hosted in a bland conference room, that's going to be really lousy television. And that's how journalists are thinking. So make sure that when you're planning your press conference that you have resources for them to kind of fill that time with images. So if you have a message, maybe, tour your camera people through your facility. If that's not possible, make sure that you have images and video ready to go that you can transfer to that journalist in the case that you don't want somebody invading the privacy of your clientele. But make sure that there are some images, something that they can take home with them at the end of the shoot. Show pictures of the impact of the programming that you're doing. If you have a needle cleanup planned, then make sure that you can allow those reporters to go along with your volunteers to pick up those needles. Or if that's not possible, show pictures of the bags and bags of needles that you've picked up. Make sure that they have images to go along with it, or bring props. If you're trying to do harm reduction and you want to give people naloxone kits, bring a naloxone kit and open it up and show the media, and the cameras will go in nice and close and they'll get those images, and it'll make for a much richer story, much more enticing story, and will make reporters want to come back and cover more stories in the future because you're thinking about how to make their job easier. Be responsive. I know this sounds like really basic stuff, but I don't know how many press releases I have received where I call the number and nobody answers, or I call the number and nobody's available to speak to me to the next day. And I'm thinking, why would you send me a press release if you're not ready for me to show up and do a story? So when you're sending out a press release, put your cell phone number on it. I want to be able to reach you while you're in the bathroom, because you've only got, one day to do this media blitz. Make sure that you are available. Answer immediately, respond promptly. Journalists are on really tight deadlines. So you want to make sure that everything's ready to go once you launch your story. So have contact info for everyone available and reserve their time. Make sure that all those interviewees you've lined up, they're ready to go. Now let's talk about whether your story is news. I'm of the opinion that any story is news if you are clever enough to make it news. Reporters are really attracted to superlatives. So that means if something is the best, or it's the worst, or it's the biggest, or it's the smallest, or I'll give you some more specific examples. Maybe this is the best year you've ever had for housing newcomers to Canada. Or maybe it is the worst year for influenza in your orphanage. You want to gain attention through kind of these extreme measures. Make sure that, or potentially your story is topical, so that means that it's in the news. At Home Space, we are converting a downtown office tower in Calgary into affordable housing and family shelter. And that's super topical because, 30% of offices in downtown Calgary are empty right now. And so, we're recycling this building into something useful, but this is on people's minds already, which makes it a really popular story for people to pick up. Maybe your story is very personal. If it's about one person who has been directly impacted, by your programming or by an issue in your city, that makes for a great story. All it takes is one personal story, and it makes it a better sell to journalists. If it's emotional, if, let's say your CEO is really upset about funding being cut, or they're elated about, your new mayor, agreeing to offer a grant to your organization. If somebody is really emotional, really, has big feelings about something that's happened, that's enough of a story if you write it well enough. And is it impactful? And that's not just to the clients that you serve, but is it impactful to a wider audience? They used to tell me when I was a journalist, will this story appeal to a regular Joe or Wendy on the West Island? Wendy on the West Island is a middle-class, middle-aged mom who works full-time, and that's your target audience. And so if this is somehow going to affect Wendy in her day-to-day, then it makes it a better sell for a wider audience and will get you more mainstream coverage. Now let's talk about when. The best time to send a press release is at 5:30 or 6 o'clock in the morning, because that's the time that the assignment editors, that the section editors come into the office and they start flipping through the day's paper and going through Twitter and going through the press releases for the day to decide what the reporters are going to cover that day. And so you want to wake up really early and send your press release at, first thing in the morning. You might not get a call until 8, 9, or 10 in the morning to follow up on that press release because they'll have had their meetings and, assigned everybody their assignments. Maybe the reporter doesn't start till 10, but the people who decide what stories are going to be covered that day are up early, so you should be up early too. And the best time to host a press conference is between 10 a.m. and 12 p.m. That's because most newscasts go on at 6 p.m. So you need to give journalists enough time to do their research, show up, do their interviews, go get a few more interviews maybe, and some images, and have time to write, edit, and get that story on the 6 o'clock news. So send your press release really early, host your press conference late in the morning. Now let's talk about coverage. So if you follow these rules and you kind of keep them in mind and be thoughtful with your press releases, then hopefully, depending on the news day, you can expect to get some pretty good coverage. In our case, we got CBC Calgary, CTV News, 660, City News, and the Calgary Herald to cover a palliative care fundraiser because we made it really personal. And hopefully, if you follow these tips, then you will have equal success going forward. Thank you so much for joining me for this section of the conference, and I guess we'll move on to questions.